The suffocating, brine-soaked fog that rolled off the turning Pacific Ocean did not merely blanket the coastal logging town of Port Sorrow, it swallowed it whole. It was the bitter, dying end of New Harbour in 1887. The air was a freezing, suspended soup of grey mist that tasted violently of rotting kelp, gutted halibut, and the sharp, acidic tang freshly fouled pine. The rotting wooden pilings of the docks groaned a mournful, rhythmic dirge against the relentless battering of the grey tide, matching the hollow, rhythmic ache pounding behind Clara's ribs. Clara stood barefoot on the freezing, splintered pine plants of the town square's auction block. She was 25 years old, the sole daughter of the town's lathe blacksmith. She did not possess the frail, swelling waistline or the delicate, porcelain features that the Crystal Society prized. Clara was a woman of colossal, undeniable physical substance. Years of swinging 12-pan crust-peen hammer rowing anvil built her fortress of flesh and bone. She possessed incredibly broad, powerful shoulders, thick, muscular thighs, and a heavy, expansive waist. Her skin was permanently dusty, a fine layer of grey coal ash, and her large, capable hands were deeply calloused and scarred by fine sparks. In the blazing heat of her father's forge, her massive size had been a magnificent, necessary virtue. Out here, in the freezing mist of the public square, she was treated as a freakish, grotesque beast of burden. Her father died 3 weeks prior, his lungs entirely calcified by suffocating consumption. He had left behind a mass of medical debts owed directly to Mayor Thaddeus Screen, a corrupt, sneering official who buried to the tally like his own personal crew vivo. Crane had instantly foreclosed on the forge, extinguishing the only fire that had ever kept Clara warm. To strap their main bounds, the mayor had dragged the grieving, heavy-set one into the freezing fog to auctionify the contract to the indentured labor to the ice bear. Mayor Crane stood saintly beneath the candice oin of the foreblasters' offers, his greasy wooden hat pulled low against the denture. He held Clara's labor contract in the girt head, waving it like a piece of bloody meat before the gathering crowd of rough, shivering longshoremen, crabbers, and timber rats. She has the back of an ox and the appetite of 3. Crane's nasal, grating voice cut through the dense ocean fog. She can haul wet nets. She can spot cordwood. I need $40 to clear the dead blacksmith's sledger. Who take the detour sweat? Clara stood paralyzed in the biting cold, her thin, faded morning dress clinging weightily to the heavy, substantial curves of her wide hips and full chest. She wrapped her thick, powerful arms tightly round her torso, instinctively trying to fold her massive frame inward, desperately attempting to shrink her broad shoulders to escape the vicious, staring eyes of the town. And she could not shrink. She was an anvil, heavy, burned, and entirely exposed to their mockery. Her dark, tear-filled eyes scanned the crowd and locked onto a familiar face standing near the bake barrels. It was Thomas, the sailmaker's son. For 3 years, Clara had secretly, foolishly orbited a quiet, tender affection for his easy smile. She had spent countless hours in the sweltering heat of her fort, repairing his iron-sewn walls and mending his heavy canvas nails fastened in your charge, just to hand a fleeting nod of this head. Mayor Crane noticed the direction of her gaze. A cruel, malicious smirk twisted beneath his waxed mustache. "What about you, Toss?" the mayor jeered, pointing God finger. "You need a strong bat all your heavy canvas. I'll get you the deed for $30. Shickley, friend you could make a waif out of her when the sun goes down." The duckwaggers erupted into a chorus of vicious, awking laughter. Thomas's face flushed a deep, embarrassed crimson. He looked up at Clara's wide, heavy-set body, her broad shoulders, and her thick waist. He did not look at her gratitude with the ease of Freilame. He hit her with obsolete, unfiltered devotion. He spat a dark string chewing tobacco directly into wet cobblestones. "I wouldn't take it to frame, cream." Thomas shimmed, his voice echoing wildly the crash and surf, ensuring every single person on the docks heard his disgust. "She's too broad and fast to love. A man wants a soft wife, not a heavy draft horse." If I went to sleep next to bother, I'd bet die in the quarry. Clara's breath vanished. The hot, stinging tears finally spilled over her dark lashes, mixing with the freezing salt spray on her rounded cheeks. The absolute, crushing reality settled heavily into her marrow. Her immense physical strength, her deep, nurturing soul, and her heavy, capable body were entirely unlovable. She was nothing but a monstrous joke to the world. If you like in this story, please subscribe. I know you must have subscribed by now, so let's continue. The howling, mocking laughter of the crowd was sorry, wildly severed. It was not sired by a shard, by an terrifying, willy, earth-shaking thud, the heavy, iron-shod court boots marching deliberately out of the impenetrable white fog of the timber trail. Stepping into the gray light of the docks was Elias Dorn, known the whispered, terrified legends of the coastal saloons as the Wraith. He was high canopy lugger whose an absolute unbroken isolation marred the ancient, towering redwoods that loomed over the town. He was a colossal, tinifogly sog man, stembemoav sipsmoav fetor. His imperably broad, heavily muscled shoulders were draped in a thick, sap-stained, waxed canvas tin coat that repelled the freezing rain. Elias was partially deaf, his eardrums permanently ruptured by catastrophic dynamite blast used to kill Lajam years ago. The same brutal accident had crushed him rather to death beneath the fallen timber. The Cassie lay in a muffled, sand wrapped that whamming vibration of lethal, foreign rapidity. Last vid absolutely physical strength and substantial, unyielding mass not as a repulsive floor, as the only true, sacred fong safety, fragile, dying world. He did not carry rifle. Rusting FAC cause his messy right shoulder was a 6-foot lugging BB, a devastatingly heavy tool consisting of a thick ashwood handle, label, line spike of a base, an 8-inch iron hooking arm used to forcefully roll 2-ton tree trunks. The sneering dogwakers instantly scrambled backward, the cruel laughter evaporating into terrified, breathless silence as the towering logger walked directly through their parting ranks. Elias did not look at the mare. He did not look at the cowardly sailmaker. His intense, dark eyes, shadowed by the brim of his battered felt hat, locked entirely onto Clara. He did not see heavy, repulsive dressed horse shivering on the block. Healed to her incredibly broad Silas, her thick, powerful thighs, and the substantial, generous breadth of her waist, and he saw a magnificent, indestructible redwood, a one-boot with enough sheer, glorious gravity to ascend hurricane. He walked directly up to the edge of the wooden auction block. May Crane nervously cleared his throat, taking acid and stepped backward. Now see here, Thorn, this is a legal town auction. Elias did not let him finish. He did not utter a single red-written syllable. The giant logger simply shifted his massive shoulders, gripped the heavy ashwood handle of the PV with both hands, and swung the 6-foot tool in a terrifying, blurring, horizontal arc. Crack! The massive iron-tipped spike of the PV slammed directly into the center of the heavy pine auction block with the devastating kinetic force of a cannonball. The thick wood violently splintered and exploded, the iron hook biting so deeply into the timber that the entire block shuddered and cracked completely in half. The entire town jumped, a collective gasp of sheer terror rippling through the freezing fog. Elias let go the embedded PV handle. He reached deep inside his heavy canvas coat and withdrew a thick, weather-beaten leather pouch. He tossed it casually into the shattered, splintered remains of the auction block. The leather tie towel undone, revealing thick step of high premier, uncashed passer railroad temporary bongs. It was a staring, incomprehensible forging. The accumulated, unspent blood wages of a decade spent risking his life in the highest, deadliest branches of the ancient forest. Mayor Crane's eye bulged, his jaw dropping entirely open as he stared at the absolute fortune resting in the ruined wood. It was enough money to buy the entire docks 3 times over. And I still did not speak. The axlead, deafening signs radiating from his towering friend was far more terrifying than threat. He simply turned his back on the greedy, stunned mayor and the cowardly, pale-faced sailmaker. He stepped up to Clara, who was trembling violently in the cold. He did not rub her like a piece of purchased livestock. Elias reached out his massive, calloused, sap-stained hand, turned his palm upward in a gesture of profound, breathtaking respect. Clara stared at his hand, her dark eyes wide with shock, before Sally placed her own heavy, ash-stained fingers into his grip. His fingers closed around hers with an iron, unyielding warmth. He gently stepped her down from the ruined block, leaving the massive paving bed in the woods a permanent, terrifying warning, and led the broad-shouldered blacksmith away from the rotting, crow shoe line, walking directly into a deep, mist-shrouded, silent sanctuary of the ancient redwoods. The trail immediately steepened, ascending rapidly from the rotting, salt-stained docks into a dizzying, vertical labyrinth of colossal, ancient bark. The redwoods were not merely trees. They were living, breathing, impenetrable monoliths that plotted out the gray coastal sky entirely, their massive, deeply grooved trunks wider than the harbor-master's umphasis they just left behind. The freezing, rain-soaked air of the harbor was instantly filtered and transformed. It lacked the putrid, suffocating stench of dead fish and desperate humanity, entirely replaced by the sharp, bracing, intoxicating scent of crushed pine needles, damp loam, and raw, ozone-rich mountain fog. Clara walked a few paces behind the towering loggia. Her heavy, soaked morning dress clung stubbornly to her thick thighs and incredibly broad shoulders. She waited in the terrifying, muffled silence for the sharp command, the breath bark of impatience. She was a heavy, robust woman, a draft horse, as the sailmaker had so cruelly shrieked. Surely, this silent, scarred giant expected her to carry his heavy canvas packs, to instantly begin earning the staggering absolute fortune he had just poured onto the shattered wood of the auction block. But Elias Thorne did not hat or a pack. He moved with a terrifying, predatory, and entirely silent grace, his massive frame navigating the treacherous, slick, moss-covered roots without snapping a single twig. When they reached a steep, violently muddy incline, Clara planted her thick bare feet deeply into the freezing soil. She did not stumble. She did not wait for a carriage. Her robust, heavily muscled legs, forced by ease hauling massive iron ingots across a sweltering watchroom, carried a substantial 200-pint weight effortlessly up the treacherous grade. After 2 hours of grueling, near-vertical climbing through the dense, dripping fog, the trail abruptly ended at the base of 3 colossal redwoods growing in a massive, perfectly triangular formation. Clara looked around the shadowed canopy, expecting a rough-hewn, drafty log cabin nestled in the damp ferns. Instead, Elias reached up and gripped a thick, braided hemp rope hanging from an impenetrable green ceiling 60 feet above. He hewed downward with a massive, corded surge of his thick shoulders. A heavy, iron-geared counterweight mechanism groaned loudly, high in the mist. Slowly, a thick, heavy-duty wind platform descended from the heavens, landing with a sword echoing through their feet. Elias stepped onto the platform, his pale, quiet eyes gesturing eye to fire. A sad 60 feet counterweight into the air. The heavy, suspended timber furnace was a breathtaking architectural model she's survival, anchored deeply into the living hardware of the 3 giant trees with massive, forged iron lag bolts. The entire cabin swayed almost imperceptibly with the ancient, rhythmic breathing of the coastal wind. Clara stepped off the platform, her broad, powerful shoulders brushing both sides of the heavy, reinforced seated frame. The interior of the carving was a claustrophobic, giant vault built exclusively to withstand the apocalyptic fury of Pacific winter storms. It smelled intensely of dried amber sap, oiled iron, and decades of profound, unbroken isolation. A massive, soot-blackened stone hearth sat in the center of the reinforced floorboards. To the left was a huge, heavy timber bed piled high with incredibly thick, dark wool and bare furs. Elias moved to the height, striking Abby sapphirite with sound mechanical efficiency. He pointed a thick, sap-stained finger toward the ivy furband. He sang the instructing to Tedbit. He then grabbed a single, worn, threadbare wool blanket from a wooden chest, turned his broad back, and walked directly out to the drafty, uninsulated enclosed porch section of the suspended cabin. He shut the heavy timber door twing with a definitive echoing click. Clara stood completely alone in the flickering orange firelight. He hadn't spoken a single word. The profound silence of his partial deafness created a heavy, oppressive, physical barrier in the room. He had just bought her labor for a king's ransom. He treated her like a piece of fragile, breakable porcelain that needed cut and tie separate for his foul, dangerous life. The myriad tosses cruel, mocking laughter band I saw it essay in the chest. Too bored in fat velar, a hairy jarth horse, shook down their mussy, ash-stained hands, her thick, powerful wrists, in the wide, generous, heavy swell of her waist. She was not a delicate, swooned society lady need to be shooed on featherbed while the master of the house falls in the damp draught. It was a profound, stinging insult to her entire existence. She was a waxme. Her father told her that metalloy held the shape way we struck, of her feast we treated as a useless, expensive brand. The next morning, the fog thickened her mincing, bruised purple as a coastal storm began to brew over the ocean. Elias had left the cabin shortly on, descending the row elevator to miss to check his high-tension lugging cables before the hurricane force winds at the canopy. Clara feasted to sit idle on the fours. She scored the ding, swaying gammon. Beneath the again storm in the grue, she found Elias's disguised brune twos. They were brutistan to potion, legal reality the high canopy. Heavy iron felling wedges curled and flattened like crushed tin cans, double-bitted felling axes with massive, jagged chips missing from their lethal steel edges, and thick iron logging chains with violently twisted, stressed links ready to snap. Clara's dark eyes narrowed, a fierce, undeniable spark of absolute authority igniting in her chest. This was her language, the unspoken, universal language of heat, gravity, and unyielding physical force. She dragged a massive, perfectly flat river stone from the corner of the room, her thick, powerful size driving the heavy weight across the floorboards, positioning it directly in front of the roaring half to act as a makeshift anvil. She built the fig into a blinding, white-hot, roaring inferno, utilizing a pair of heavy leather bellows she found hanging near the woodpile. She didn't have her beloved 12-pound crossbeam hammer, but she dug through a scrap box and found a side, broken iron sledge head that weighed merely 10 pounds. It would serve. Clara stripped off the heavy, ruined, salt-stained morning dress. She stood before a roaring fire in only her thick, white cotton undergarments. The thin, damp fabric danced nothing dyed the monumental, substantial breadth of her shawls, a thick, clawed muscle of her heavy arms, or the wide, generous, incredibly full curves of her heavy waist and hips. She did not cane to salt her. She plunged the ruined, flattened iron felling wedges directly into the growing red coals. When the iron glowed a brilliant, translucent, bloody orange, Clara pulled from the fire with a pair of rusted iron tongs. She planted her bare feet firmly on the ivy-seeded floorboards, anchoring her massive weight. She raised the tin-band iron sledge head high above her head. She did not swing the iron with her fragile wrists. Clara utilized the immense, undeniable, magnificent physical mass of her entire heavy body. She drove her thick thighs and incredibly broad shoulders forcefully downward, bringing a heavy iron buck down upon the glowing wedge with a deafening, earth-shaking, catastrophic crash. Sparks threw a brilliant, violent shooting stars across the dim, claustrophobic cavern. She struck again and again, establishing a rhythmic, musical, devastatingly powerful cadence. Clang, clang, clang. The heavy, ringing sound of the forge completely drowned out the howling, rising coastal wind battering the outside of the suspended fortress. She sweated profusely, her skin glowing with a vibrant, vital, radiant heat. A heavy, uncorseted chest heaved with deep, powerful, ragged gusts of exertion. Every swing the heavy iron purged the humiliation of the auction block from her soul. She was not a useless, fat burden. She was an absolute, terrifying force of nature, bending the very bones of the earth to her will. She took Eliza's shattered, ruined axes into ghastly, and depowering steel back into lethal, razor-sharp perfection. At Slayton, a heavy sea door of the cabin burned open. Our sporn stood at the howling gale, a freeing rain dripping heavily from his waxed canvas coat. He frozen in the threshold, his pale eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated shock. The freezing, drafty, dead silence of a suspended tomb had been completely, violently eradicated. The inn cabin was blisteringly hot, sully intensely swatched iron, bending pine, and wall undeniable alive. And standing before the widening, white-hot hut was Clara. She was caught in dark, smudged soot. Her thick, powerful arms glistened heavy sweat, her incredibly broad shoulders rising and falling with her heavy breathing. Her generous, substantial curves moved with terrifying, breathtaking, predatory grace as she brought the massive iron weight down, perfectly and effortlessly reforging his rude steel. She, like a mythological chiting, a goddess of befrost completely whirling. Elias stared and breath feebly vanishing for his messy lines. For Peggy, he had lived in a muffled world of constant, terrifying gravity, watching massive trees crush everything he loved, desperately searching for something solid enough to survive the crushing weight of the brutal coast. He lit of the heavy, incredibly broad-shouldered wound hammering red-hot iron with their bare, magnificent strength, and the scarred logger realized with a sudden, violent clarity the town had not sold in a draft horse. They had sold in the absolute, indestructible bedrock of the earth. The heavy iron sledgehead struck the makeshift stone anvil one final, resounding time, the deafening clang vibrating intensely through the thick, suspended floorboards of the canopy cabin. Clara lowered the makeshift hammer, her broad, soot-stained chest heaving with ragged, powerful gasps. She turned slowly, her dark eyes locking into the colossal, wet silhouette of Elias Stone standing utterly paralyzed in the doorway. The freezing coastal wind howled through the open threshold, whipping the freezing rain into the blisteringly hot, forge-warmed air, but neither of them moved. The unspoken, charged tension in the claustrophobic room was thick enough to struck the hammer. Afore Liska stepped forward, the atmosphere picturing saw the suspended fortress whiningly, sickeningly plotting. The bruised, purple twilight huts or the winter instantly vanished into pitch-black darkness. It was not this them that moved their gear. It was a devastating Pacific cyclone making direct landfall against the ancient Oregon coastline. The three colossal redwood trees anchoring the cabin groaned with a terrifying, deep, subterranean vibration that shipped the very sap in their ancient veins. The cabin pitched violently sideways, the massive forged iron lag bolts screaming against the living wood as hurricane-force winds slammed into reinforced cedar walls. Lisa's survival instincts instantly overrode his shock. He dropped his heavy canvas pack, lounging across the tilting floorboards to slam the heavy timber door shut, throwing the thick iron deadbolt. Because of his ruptured eardrums, Elias lit an immediate underwater world. He could not hear the high-pitched, metallic shriek of the wind tearing through the high canopy. He operated entirely on vibration and seek. But Clara heard, high above the cabin, it stilled by the churring, violent dummies, a sound like a cannon shot ripped through the howling maelstrom. It was the agonizing, catastrophic crack of Widowmaker, a massive, dead redwood branch weighing nearly 2 tons, sapping completely the main trunk in cyclonic winds. Lice, Clara screamed, her waist entirely swathed by the root of the storm. Elias threw and hew the wine, mowed he the catastrophic descent to the tower. He was torn back from the door when the scene above him simply ceased to exist. The sheer, devastating kinetic force of the 2-ton Widowmaker obliterating the reinforced cedar roof was apocalyptic. The happy timber beams splintered into jagged, lethal shrapnel. A deluge of freezing rain, broken pine boughs, and blinding darkness instantly flooded the cabin. The colossal branch crushed directly onto the floorboards, pinning Lies Thorn swirly beneath its immense, unyielding girth. The cabin falling shuddered, dropping a sickening 2 feet as the suspension cable strained under the sudden, massive influx of dead weight. The roaring fire in the haft was instantly extinguished by the pouring rain, plunging the ruined sanctuary into a freezing, chaotic gloom, lit only by the sporadic, terrifying flashes of coastal lightning. Clara was thrown to her knees by the impact, her thick, soot-stained hands catching her heavy frame against the wet floorboards. She scrambled frantically through the waning debris and splintered cedar. Elias was trapped flat on his back. The massive, back-covered Widowmaker rested directly across his incredibly broad chest, the sheer, crushing weight of the wood pressing his ribcage dangerously close to sapping. His pale eyes were wide with a sudden, suffocating panic. A wet, ragged wheeze was scraping his lips as his lungs were untied pratt of oxygen. The fainting rain was rapidly soaking his cabin's gout, and the violent shock of the impact was threatening to stop his massive heart entirely. A frail, swinging society woman would have completely frozen in terror, entirely incapable of altering the brutal physics of the disaster. But Clara was not frail. She was one of colossal, monumental, undeniable physical substance, built in the blazing fires of a forge. She did not scream for help that would never come. Her dark eyes darted through the gloom, locking onto the 6-foot iron-tipped logging peavey resting against the far wall. Clara launched for the heavy tool. She scrambled back to the tread, dined, sliding her bare, thick legs into the freezing rain pouring on the floor. She valiantly thrust a foot-long iron spike of the peavey directly onto the edge of the crushed roof beam supporting the Widowmaker, dighting the hinged iron hook deeply into the bedrock of the messy branch. So that the team to ply the two-ton tool with her wrist two arms. She knew the absolute, uncompromising laws of leverage and gravity. Clara dropped into a deep, incredibly wide squat beside the trapped logo. She watched the thick ashwood handle of the peavey directly against her broad, heavy, soot-stained shoulder. She planted her bare, calloused feet firmly against an spruced forge rest, anchoring herself to the very bone to the suspended cabin. Breep, Elias, quarried wide into the arcade. She quite her right had trailed every cent that the lifelong nation, every cruel gear about her massive size, and the raw, unadulterated physical mass of her 200-pound, heavily muscled body. She threw her entire, substantial, robust weight violently backward, driving her incredibly thick, powerful thighs forcefully into the floorboards. The ashwood handle of the peavey bowed terrifyingly, rowing under the impossible strain. The muscles in Clara's broad back and thick waist bulged, cord, and bent with agonizing, tearing electric fire. She screamed, a feral, primal, deafening roar of absolute, unyielding defiance against the mantis itself. Crunch. The musty, 2-ton Widowmaker groaned, shifting agonizingly against the splintered floorboards. Utilizing the immense, undeniable quality of fire's literal, physical counterweight, fire managed to lead the colossal timber exactly 4 inches upward. It was just enough. Elias, upwarding on pure, desperate survival instinct, his thick, heavily scarred hands into wet wood and violently dragged his cursed torso backly, sawed out beneath the lethal timber just a fraction of a second before the peavey handle sacked for Clara's swiftly shore. The heavy branch sent beckons her forward with a deafening, cabin-shaking thud. Clara clutched backward, her chest heaving with ragged, desperate gasps. But there was no time to rest. The gaping, jagged hole in the roof was flaying the freezing, psychotic rain directly to the cabin. Lice was cold on sight, his massive frame seized by violent, terrifying, uncontrollable rigors. The catastrophic shock of the impact, combined with the freeing deluge, was sending her rapidly to lethal opposite. Claw caught through the wet debris. She grabbed the massive logger by his thick canvas collar and utilized her heavy, powerful legs to drag his semi-conscious, shivering body across the ruined floorboards, pulling him into the single, dry, sheltered corner of the cabin beneath the heavy timber bed frame. The hearth was dead. There was no fire to save him. There was only her, Clara acted with the absolute, uncompromising pragmatism of survival. She violently stripped off his soaking wet, heavy canvas coat, his flannel shirt, and his heavy boots, leaving his broad, heavily scared, violently shivering chest bare to the freezing air. She then reached down, stripped away her own soaking, soot-stained undergarments. She did not possess a single ounce of shame regarding her messy, filthy body. In the freezing, howling dark, her jingo's weight was not a curse. It was the absolute, literal view of life. She dragged the heavy, dry wolf in bare fears over her berth, creating an airtight, insulated cocoon in the darkest corner of the shattered cabin. Clara pulled the massive, shivering giant directly into her arms. She wrapped her thick, handy, heat-radiating thighs tightly over his freezing legs. She pressed her incredibly broad, warm shoulders against her shivering back and put his head firmly against the soft, generous, abundant swell of her uncorseted breasts. She wrapped her thick, capital arms entirely around his crushed, bruised ribcage, pressing her heavy, substantial stomach flush against his torso. She used the immense, biological furnace of her large, robust body to forcefully drive her deep, blazing, forge-born heat directly into his freezing, dying core. For an hour, the violent bone rattling trimmed of his shock pressing to shake him beneath beneath the heavy pelts. The cyclone raged outside, tearing to redwoods, and inside the torque furlong century, Clara held the giant with an immovable, unyielding, maternal gravity. Slowly, the ravaged shivering began to recede. The deep, heavy, radiant warmth of her substantial body penetrated his icy veins, anchoring his feet solid to the earth. Sadly, in the pitch-black darkness, Elias let out a more giant, worthless sob than my brain harshly against her collarbone. I couldn't lift it, Elias wept, his voice a broken, raspy whisper, his mind violently pulled back into the darkest, most agonizing trauma of his past by the crushing weight of the Widowmaker. The jam broke, the timber rolled, that pinned him, my bro. He was trapped in the mud. Clara's heart shot in her chest. She tightened her heavy, yielding embrace, pressing her soft, wan cheek directly against his damp, wildly tangled hair. I pulled so hard my hands bled, but I was too weak. Elias cried out, his massive, heavily scared hands blindly, frantically clutching at the soft, heavy flesh of her wide waist. I couldn't move the tree. And the dynamite, the blast took my hearing. I couldn't even hear his last words. I just watched him die in the dirt because I wasn't strong enough. I wasn't heavy enough to move the world. The tears spilled freely down Chloe's face, mixing with the soot to rain on her cheeks. She understood now. The giant's obsession with massive tools, thick timber, and absolute physical strength wasn't born of arrogance. It was born of a devastating, suffocating, lifelong guilt. "You not in the might, lies," Clara whispered fiercely, pressing her mouth directly to his so the vibration in her voice would pierce his muffled sighs. "You safe. Mine holding you." Elias shifted his massive weight beneath the furs. He pushed himself up slickly, his pale, hunted eyes finding her flushed, beautiful face in the shadows. His breathing hitched. He reached down with his massive, scarred hand, his thick fingers trembling violently as they made the dark. He touched her incredibly broad, powerful shoulder. He traced a thick, heavy, muscular curve to her arm. His mussed hind moved down, roundly, adorably gooping the substantial, shadowless, heavy swath of white hair in a thick waist. He didn't feel a repulsive, masculine draft horse. He felt the absolute, undeniable, physical manifestation everything I prayed for in the freezing mud decade. He felt raw, indestructible power. He felt the very joy of his survival. "They loved you," Elias whispered, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, holy intensity, tears streaming freely down his scarred, pewed cheeks. "They called you two brothers for love." He leaned forward, burying his weeping face directly into the soft, yielding, incredibly warm sanctuary of her heavy chest, his massive arms wrapping completely around her thick torso with a desperate, consuming reliance. "They are blind," Hollow cowards, the giant wept, clinging to her generous mass as if she were the only solid object in a dying universe. You are not too heavy, Clara. You are a century of flesh. You are the only thing in this brutal, rotting world strong enough to hold my soul together. Which country are you watching this video from? Please let me know in the comments below. The profound, unvarnished truth of that confession did not simply vanish into the freezing, rain-lashed darkness of the shattered cabin. It seeped directly into the very marrow of Clara's bones, permanently and irrevocably fusing her spirit to the scarred giant weeping in her arms. She held Elias Starn through the darkest, coldest hours of the night, entirely unashamed of her heavy, heat-radiating body, serving as the absolute living furnace that pulled his nascent, shivering frame back from the precipice of hypothermic death. The catastrophic Pacific cyclone raged for 2 full days, battering the ancient coastal canopy with a blind, apocalyptic fury before finally exhausting its wrath against the Oregon shoreline. On the dawn of the 3rd day, the howling winds died away, leaving behind a bruised, dripping, and profoundly silent world. Inside the suspended, rude fortress, the freezing air tasted sharply ozone, shed of pine needles, and the cold, damp scent of wet ash. The massive, 2-ton Widowmaker still rested menacingly across the splintered floorboards, but the gaping hole in the roof now allowed a single, blinding shaft of pale morning sunlight to pierce the gloom. Clara stood near the shattered stone half. She was wearing the heavy, oversized canvas work shirt she had found at Elias's trunk, the thick fabric belted tightly over the wide, generous flare of her hips and her heavy thighs. She had spent the last 48 hours meticulously binding Elias's bruised and cracked ribs with long, torn strips of canvas, utilizing her heavy, gentle hands to secure his massive chest. She reached down, her thick, powerful fingers wrapping around the smooth hickory handle of a massive 12-pound iron sledgehammer. While the giant had sledged the shunk, Clara had not been idle. She had taken the heavy iron sledgehead she used as a makeshift anvil and forcefully wedged a thick, hardwood handle into its eye, driving steel shims into the wood to lock the lethal, blunt instrument together. She hefted the immense weight easily, resting the heavy iron hill in the floorboards, her broad shoulders rawing with absolute, undeniable capability. Elias sat on the edge of the heavy fur bed, his torso heavily bandaged, his thick driver's coat draped over his massy shoulders. His pale, slate-gray eyes tracked her every movement with a dark, intense, burn reverence. He was just reaching for his heavy leather boots when his entire, colossal frame suddenly went entirely, terrifyingly rigid. Because his eardrums are ruptured, Elias lived in a world dictated entirely by the deep, physical resonance of the earth. He didn't hear the men approaching. He felt them. He placed his massive, heavily scarred palm flat against the tribling seat of Flavance. The ancient, rhythmic swaying of the suspended cabin was wrong. There was a sudden, violent slack in the primary suspension cables, followed by the deep, rhythmic, metallic third of heavy iron climbing spikes being driven aggressively into the living heartwood of the colossal redwood trunk directly outside the door. Clara, Elias Rungwood, his voice low, gravelly vibration that instantly dropped the temperature in the room. His pale eyes dilated, the warm, devoted primary entirely vanishing, instantly replaced by the terrifying, feral apex predator of the high canopy. The elevator cables just went completely slack. We are being boarded. Down in the muddy, rotting docks of Port Sorrow, Thaddeus Crane had watched the cyclone tear the coastal mountains apart. A scene no man could survive the catastrophic destruction of the high canopy, Crane had gathered a posse of 5 heavily armed, desperate coastal smugglers. He wanted the multi-million-dollar timber deeds hidden in the lugger's capping, and he wanted the heavy leather pouch of bearer bonds Elias had thrown onto the auction block. They'd hiked through the wreckage, cut the counterweight ropes to show the giant of escape, and scaled the massive emergency climbing spikes driven to the bark. A fool Clark had even raised the 12-pound sledgehammer. The heavy, reinforced sea door of the cabin was violently, catastrophically breached. The deafening, percussive drone, the 10-gauge shotgun completely obliterated the morning silence. The heavy blast of buckshot blew the forged iron hinges entirely out of the doorframe, sending the thick timber slab crashing inward across the floorboards. A blinding, choking cloud of Ward's gun smoke in the sour, suffocating stench of cheap whiskey and wet wool flooded the enclosed porch. 3 armed smugglers poured through the ruined threshold, their rusted oars and long eyes drawn, inspecting to find the crushed, rotting corpse of the deaf lion. Elias Storn did not cower, and he did not retreat. He ignored the agonizing, stabbing pain as cracked ribs entirely. The giant launched himself on the bed with the specific histotecaneti fossa coiled steel spring. He didn't reach for a firearm, and the claustrophobic confined space a suspended cabin, a rifle ristri slewed. Light reached the wall and reached a musset 6-foot Truscott line Sardarit de Fontaine Pates. The misery whip was a terrifying, flexible ribbon of razor-sharp Toledo steel, lined with massive 2-inch rake of teeth designed to violently tear through the densest, most ancient hardware earth. Elias roared, a guttural, earth-shaken, demonic sound that vibrated the very sap in the trees. He gripped the heavy wooden handles of both ends of the saw, bending a 6-foot steel blade into lethal, trembling U-shape, and charged directly into the billowing white gun smoke. He went the tear-thinly thorough. The smugglers didn't even have time to cock their hammers. Elias unleashed the master tension of the bent steel. The 6-foot saw snapped out with like catastrophic razor-toothed whip. The lethal steel caught the first smuggler directly across the chest and throat, the massive iron rake of teeth effortlessly tearing through his heavy wool coat and the far-time fish beneath with a searing, wet, tearing shhh air. The man was well lithed off his boots, his blood spraying in a wide, dark crimson arc across the cedar walls as he was thrown backward out the open doorway, plummeting 60 feet to the forest floor. The sickened smuggler fired wildly, the board grazing the thick canvas of Elias's shore. The giant didn't flinch. He thrust his momentum, drawing a heavy wooden handle of the sword directly into the man's face, entirely shattering his jaw, before violently plunging the flexible steel blade forward, throwing the encouraged port into an inescapable, bloody nightmare of swinging, tearing iron. But the sheer, chaotic, deafening violence of the melee at the front door put a fatal, cowardly distraction. Mere thighs crane and knock length the front spikes. The corrupt, rat-like official had scaled the rear of the colossal trunk, accessing a cannon for the giant, aping horde the wheel he had torn through the ring. Crane darted soaring onto a springy flowwounds behind car. His greasy wind coat was sewed, his waxed mustache drooping over a cruel, malicious sneer. He held a heavy, nickel-plated Webley revolver. Van Ray pulled back, aimed directly at the center of Clark's broad, uncoarsened back. "I told you I'd collect my debt, you massive, useless cow," Crane hissed, his grating voice cutting through the ringing echoes of the shotgun blast. Clara froze, the heavy sledgehammer resting by her bruise. Her broad quad painfully in her throat as the ground and town clicked the raw sand locked into bat bagged her. "Turned around," Crane commanded, gesturing the barrel of the gun. He looked at the chaos at the front door, watching the giant slaughter his men, but he kept his weapon trained on the heavy woman. "You cost me $40 on the docks, Clara, but the deeds in this cabin will make me a king. Pick up the bearer buns from the table and move oil blew a hole through you fat spy." He expected her to weep. He expected the front humiliated green Becksmith's daughter from the freezing paddock sweat to collapse onto her thick knees, beckoned our miserable life, paralyzed by the sheer, suffocating shame he had relentlessly driven into her soul. Clara did not weep. She did not attempt to shrink her massive, broad shoulders or hide her incredibly generous, heavy curves. The suffocating, lifeline terrors being heavy, ridiculed victim vanished entirely. It was completely incinerated by blinding, white-hot inferno of absolute protective fury. She was not a helpless draft horse to be auctioned in the mud. She was the matriarch of the high canopy. She was the immovable anvil that forced the broken lugger's soul back together. She possessed absolute, undeniable, monumental fecal power. Clawed her its lead to face the corrupt mare. Her dark eyes were devoid of fear. They were pitch-black voids of legal, uncompromising promise. "You called me too big for love," Clara stated, her voice remarkably steady, dropping to a low, terrifying register that resonated with the sheer gravity of a falling mountain. She did not reach for the bare bounds. She dropped into a deep, incredibly wide stance, planting heavy, bare feet firmly onto splintered sea floorboards, anchoring a massive weight. Crane's eyes widened slightly in confusion. "Peck at the rebel, you dumb beast," he squealed, his figure tapping on the tree. Cora reached down with her thick, calloused hands and gripped the smooth hickory handle of the 12-pound iron sledgehammer. A frail, starving Saskatchewan would have lacked the sheer bone density to even lift the massive tube at her waist. Clara was forged in the absolute, blistering heat of the blacksmith's fire. She utilized immense, undeniable, magnificent physical mass of her entire 200-pound body. "I am not a beast," Clara roared, a primal, battle cry that rivaled the roaring giant at the front door. She didn't attempt to swing the 12-pound iron block with just her wrists. She channeled every single ounce of her accumulated humiliation, her boundless, feast erosion to a scarred giant fighting for their sanctuary, and the raw undoubtery that fake loss of Rivy, Jadrus biting. She drove their faint, pieful thought and her incredible adored shores forcefully upward a violent, devastating, twisty arc. Crane panicked, his finger violently jerking the trigger of the Webley. Beg. The blade tore through the fleshy, substantial outer of the Clara's thick-lat bicep, spraying hot blood across the floorboards. But the sheer, robust mass of a heavy, heavily missiled arm entirely zoo the canted shark. It did not shatter the vine, it absolutely did not stop her devastating forward the mentor. Clara swung the 12-pound iron sledgehammer like a side of pure vengeance. The heavy iron block blurred through the damp air, carrying the unstoppable kinetic force of a derailed locomotive. Crane couldn't even raise his arms to block it. Crack. The impact was catastrophic. Clara slammed the flat, 12-pound iron head of the sledgehammer directly into the center of Mere Crane's chest. The sickening, deafening sound his ribcage entirely collapsing under the sheer, devastating, crushing weight of her broad-shouldered swing echoed violently over the storm's aftermath. The sheer momentum of her heavy, twisting body physically lifted the corrupt official entirely of his leather boots. Crane was launched violently backward, the Webley revolver flying uselessly from his dead-end, nerve-shocked grip. He flew entirely backward through the jagged, splintered hole in the cabin wall where the Widowmaker had struck. Crane didn't even have the breath in his ruined lungs to scream as he plummeted 60 feet through the freezing coastal air, his broken body crashing violently through the lower pine boughs before hitting the forest floor with a dull, heavy, final thought. Clara dropped the massive sledgehammer. It hit the floorboard with a heavy, resonating clang. Her full, heavy chest was heaving with deep, ragged gasps, her thick, bleeding arm trembling violently from the mess of the adrenaline spike, her face flushed a dark, vibrant crimson with absolute, magnificent exertion. She stood tall, entirely unshaken in her immense size, her heavy path of body raised supreme the shattered ruins of the Canopy Fortress. At the front door, the cantic sounds of the tearing crosscut sulk and plea ceased. Lies Thorne stepped slowly back into the mag chamber, a flexible steel sword drooping dark turns on to the word. His massive chest heaved, his pale eyes wild and dilated with feral panic, fully expecting to find his anchor bleeding out on the floor. He lifted the discarded revolver. He hit the massive sledgehammer, the gaping hole in the wall, and the blood dripping down the thick, powerful muscle of Clyde's arm. And then, the colossal mountain sovereign looked directly at her. She stood triumphantly amidst the splintered wreckage, the oversized canvas shirt stained his suit in blood, her dark hair wild and untamed. She was not shrinking. She was not attempting to hide her incredibly broad shoulders or her abundant, magnificent curves. She met his shocked, feral gaze with a fierce, resplendent fire blazing dark eyes, an unspoken, silent roar of absolute, unbreakable defiance. Lies did not utter a single word. He dropped the bloody crosscut sword, the metal clang loudly against the floor, entirely ignoring his cracked ribs as he rushed across the cabin, pulling his fierce, powerful Absolute Queen directly into his massive, blood-soaked chest. The crushing, unyielding vice of Elias's heavily muscled arms enveloping her generous, broad-shouldered frame was the only physical anchor keeping Clara tethered to the splintered, blood-slick seat of floorboards. The atmospheric pressure within the suspended cabin was thick and suffocating, entirely saturated with the sharp, acidic sting of expended gunpowder, the damp, loamy scent of shredded redwood bark, and the warm, metallic stench of 7 catastrophic rollins. Yet, pressed flush against the towering logger's violently heaving chest, Clara inhaled only the deep, grounding aroma of crushed pine needles, oiled canvas, and absolute, terrified devotion. She buried her face directly into the crook of his thick, coiled neck, her soot-stained, calloused hands gripping the heavy fabric of his coat with a desperate, iron-fisted intensity as the monumental adrenaline of the slaughter slowly began to drain from her robust, trembling limbs. Elias held her as though releasing his grip would cause the ancient, colossal trees supporting them to snap in half. His massive, sap-stained hand cradled the back of her head, his incredibly thick fingers tangling deeply into her dark, wildly unpenned hair. He buried his bearded, heavily scarred face into the salt, yielding, heat-radiating crib, her broad shoulder, his colossal frame shaking with deep, jagged, ragged gasps. The apex portent, the high capi, the feral race who had just decimated an armed boarding party with a crosscut saw, was trembling entirely out of the sheer, paralyzing terror of almost losing the heavy, magnificent woman in his arms. Slowly, the reaming in Clara's ears fade, replaced by the howling rush of the coastal wind tearing through the gaping hole in the wall and the rhythmic, musical dripping of the rain. Elias reluctantly, carefully pulled back from her soft warmth. His pale, slate-gray eyes frantically scared her flushed face, his gaze tracing every inch of her features before dropping to the dark, wet crimson stain rapidly spreading across the fleshy, substantial outer curve of her thick left bicep. The bullet had torn a deep, ugly gouge through the muscle, but her sheer, heavy mass had prevented the lead from shattering the bone. "You bleeding?" the lass rumbled, his voice low, gravelly vibration that instantly dropped the temperature in the roan. His thick jaw clenched with a profound, agonizing guilt as he looked at the ruin of his century, the shattered door, the pooling blood, the massive sledgehammer resting by her boots. Clara did not wait for his silent brooding to fester. She took him by his massive, uninjured right wrist and led the towering giant directly to the heavy fear-lined bed. She gently pushed him down to sit on the edge of the mattress. Moving with powerful, unhurried efficiency, she fetched a clean linen rag and a heavy glass bottle of harsh-grain alcohol from a surviving wooden crate. She stood between his spread knees, her heavy, uncorseted thighs brushing against his shins. With absolute, unyielding pragmatism, Cora uncorked the bottle with her teeth and poured the biting, clear liquid directly over the abin-rilled wad on her own arm. The white-hot, searing pain is blinding, Clara did not scream. She possessed the iron pain tolerance of a blacksmith. Her massive, broad shoulders tensed, the thick muscles coiled beneath her skin, but her face remained a mask of stoic, undeniable stone. Elias's breath etched. He immediately reached out, his massive hands gently taking the linen rag from her grip. For a man who wielded 6-foot steel swords and possessed the brute strength to fell ancient timber, his touch was revelation, absolute breathtaking tenons. He meticulously wiped the hot blood from her thick, powerful arm, wrapping the wound tightly with clean cotton strips. He didn't look at her heavy arm with disgust. He treated her flesh like the most sacred, priceless tapestry he had ever been trusted to hold. When the wound was bound tightly, Elias did not pull her back into his embrace. Instead, he stood up abruptly, creating sudden, chilling physical distance between them in the drafty, ruined cabin. He walked silently to the shattered auction block he had brought at the mountain, the heavy wooden crate he used as a footlocker. He reached inside and extracted the thick, weather-beaten leather pouch he had thrown into the freezing mud of Port Saul. He carried to the heavy timber table and dropped it. The cycling of exhausted, soft, lice Ross. His voice was entirely hollow, shrit to all the light rating TED Talk once he had shaded her in the dark affairs. He refused to look her face, staring rigidly at the leather pouch. The coastal road to San Francisco will be cleared by the logging crews within a fortnight. There's over 80,000 diet and uncashed Pacific Railroad bearer bonds in that leather. A fortune beyond counting. Clar's art seized, a cold, jagged spike of dread piercing her chest. She took a step toward the temple, her dark eyes widening. Why you cling to the letter? Lies. Because you hold the keys to a complete existence now, the giant growled, the words tearing out of his throat like swallowed glass. He gripped the edge of the timber table until his thick knuckles turned bone white. I secured carriage account in Portland. You pack these bonds. You will ride straight down to the sea. You purchase a sprawling, manicured estate on uphill. You can employ strated dozens. You'll never, for the rest of their beautiful lives, have to sway twice to defend your own lives. You will be entirely insulated from the cruel mockery of uneducated dock workers. He finally looked up, his pale eyes completely shattered, filled with a self-loathing so immense it threatened to swallow the ruined canopy. Look at this fall, Clara. Look at the balloon. I'm a deaf, feral beast who lives in a rotten tree and speaks through butchery. I cannot protect you from the greed of the civilized world when I enchain to this violent mountain. You shouted a man's chest today because of my presence. I will not allow my darkness to destroy your magnificence so young. Go find a sophisticated, gentle man who can provide you with a life of soft, unblemished agons. Carr stood completely paralyzed, the breath back in her hands. Are you tempted to bans me? I'm attempting to save you. Elias roared, the southern explosive vine with his voice echoing violently against the redwood trunks outside. He gestured frantically to his own blood-stained canvas coat and the brutal jacket scars traversing his face. You deserve the faintest pars the world has to offer, not a blood-soaked, freezing cage in the sky. Elias squeezed his eyes tightly shut, his massive chest caning on itself. He drearily too was committing the ultimate anti-selfless devotion by sacrificing his own happiness for safety. He rooted for the rustle of the lay pars, bracing his soul for the excruciating final sound of the elevator descending, leaving him to rot in the silent canopy forever. Clara stared at the heavy leather pouch. It represented the ultimate passport to absolute, luxurious comfort. It was the financial power to silence every cruel voice that ever degraded her, a means to buy respect from society always treated her as an invisible, cognizant dog. Clara walked slowly toward the table. She did not reach out and pack the leather pouch into her satchel. She picked a thick leather bag with a heavily cast in parfums. She untied the wide cord. She blew a staggering, incomprehensible fortune preen watermark slowed paper bearer was. Without the superficial of the seagull's hesitation, Clara utilized the sheer, magnificent physical power of their broad shoulders and thick wrists. She gripped the massive stack of paper wealth, twisting her heavy hands in opposing directions, and violently ripped the entire fortune completely in half. Elias's eyes snapped open at the half-tearing Sam. His massive jaw dropped, his pale eyes widening in absolute, staggered bewilderment. Clara didn't stop. She tore the thick stacks again, reducing $80,000 to useless jacket shreds. She pivoted on her bare heel, marched directly to the gaping, splintered hole in the cabin wall where Mayor Crane had fallen, and violently held the shredded confetti of wealth out into the howling coastal wind. The paper scattered like dead leaves, blown out over the churning Pacific Ocean, pinned clean entirely unrecoverable. What have you done? Elias joked out, his voice completely devoid of breath. That was your entirely new life. That was your absolute safety. Clara turned to face him, the pale morning sunlight illuminating her robust, magnificent silhouette. She did not look like a woman who had just discarded empire. She looked like a one who had just conquered the very earth herself. My safety? Clara demanded, her voice rang out that unyielding, crystalline authority that commanded the very wind to cease. She closed the distance between them with heavy, probostal, majestic strides. You believe a stack of paper in a fancy coastal drawing room provides safety. The civilized world you want to send me to is the exact same world that stood in the freezing fog, looked at my substantial body, and called me a fat, repulsive draft horse. They despise women who take out sprays. I have no desire to purchase their hollow respect. She stopped mere inches from his towering frame, forcing the giant to look down into her blazing, resolute gaze. I was starved for a single ounce of genuine reverence my entire life, Clara stated, her voice trembling with an overwhelming tectonic affection. And I found it in the freezing dark, wrecked in the arms of a deaf giant who held my heavy waist and wept because he finally found something strong enough to encame. I'm not the sinuous mountain, Elias Thorne. I am claiming. She reached hard, her thick, capital hands gripping the lapels of his ruined canvas coat, and pulled his massive form downward. His knees, weakened by the sheer, staggering force of devotion, buckled against the floorboards. He collapsed to a full, his massive, heavily built face coned to rest directly against the soft, hewing, abundant swell of uncoercive backbone. He called me sanctuary, flarm so fiercely, her things weeing down, cradling scarred hand with absolute feast maternity. And you are the only man worthy of my strength. I'm not leading you. The impenetrable, stoic fortress Elias had maintained for decades finally completely disintegrated. A woo guttural saw towards for his thought. The sun set profound, agonizing lee that seemed to crack the very fibers beneath him. He wrapped with myset heavily cored onth and tie around the back of her wide, stankel thighs, burying his weeping face into the soft, warm fabric of her oversized shirt. He clung to her with a desperate, drawing intensity, his broad shoulders shaking violently as they accumulated grief and crushing isolation as entire life was washed away by the unyielding prance. My angry, Elias wept, his tears soaking into her gomers, her voice muffled of her heavy stomach. My absolute, undiscernible queen. He held her there amidst the roared, spirited wreck to the cabin, the distant, crashing roar of the Pacific tide singing a victory song over the silence of the defeated men. The staggering fuchin of the timber syndicate blew completely forgotten in the wind, as Elias Thorne knelt before the magnificent, broad-shouldered woman had Chesen's jagged reality in a gilded cage, he understood he possessed the treasuring the raw of the trilly-howled weight. 5 years later, the high canopy of the ancient Oregon redwoods was a breathtaking tapestry of vibrant, thriving length. The transition of the seasons had painted the coastal mountains in brilliant swathes of emerald pine and blooming, fragrant sea thrift. The suspended timber fortress bore no resemblance to a claustrophobic Batlascar II. Been massively expanded into a sprawling, multi-tiered architectural masterpiece, suspended between 5 colossal trins by heavy, forged iron chains. A massive, wraparound cedar deck offered an unobstructed, awe-inspiring view of the churning Pacific Ocean far below. The oppressive, pointed isolation of the canopy had been entirely supplanted by the rich, comforting aromas of roasting venison, blooming jasmine, and the sharp, clean scent of a roaring forge. Situated on a specially reinforced, stone-paved section of a wide deck was a fully operational, high-altitude blacksmith forge. Standing before the blinding, white-hot coals was Clara. She wore heavy leather protective aprons over a simple, dark linen dress that hid her messy, alpha thighs and the wide, incredibly generous flared hips. She was weight-hotly, breathtakingly healthy. The fatal, exhausted, humid god of the freezing washer block was a blisket, unrecognizable ghost. She ruled with gentle, unshakable confidence, owning her broad, heavy shoulders and her powerful stride with the absolute, undeniable grace of a monarch. She raised a heavy hammer, ringing down upon a glowing iron hinge with a resounding, musical cling echoed beautifully through the forest. Sitting comfortably in a mossy, custom-built cedar rocking chair a few yards away was Elias. He wore a clean flannel shirt, as sleet rode at to expose his thick, ably muscle 4 eyes. The cold, dead, feral terror in his pale eyes had been permanently replaced by a warm, watchful, incredibly deep peace. Resting effortlessly against his massive, broad chest, supported entirely by his large, gentle hands, was a remarkably sturdy, plump, giggling 2-year-old boy with thick, dark curls and bright, slight gray eyes, fiercely trying to pull at his father's thick beard. Clara lew at a hammer, wiping the sweat from her flushed brow with the back of her thick wrist. She turned, her dark eyes sparkling with profound, overflowing joy, and smiled at the 2 giants in the rocking chair. Elias smiled back, a deep, rich expression that transformed his scarred face entirely. He didn't just look at her, he worshipped her, his gaze filled with an adoration that was legendary Karsling Tartartry. The far-town, judgmental society festering in the coastal mud find low Cupid's hollow, withering illusions. Here, suspended in the immortal canopy, the silent Leviathan had anchored his very soul to a magnificent, heavy-set queen, forever worshipping the immense, breathtaking gravity of a woman built wide enough to hold his entire world.